Hi again. So today we're continuing our narration, and whereas on Monday, we dealt with the invasion of Cambodia in 1970. Today, we're going to turn our attention to Laos and 1971 and the invasion of Laos, which certainly this was part of Nixon's attempt to make Vietnamization work. And it was an important event, as you'll see. Now, I guess before we start, we should turn our attention to the review questions. And on this, one should note that we got an advisory from the dean saying that the final exams should be 2 hours rather than 3 hours. This is, of course, in light of the strike and so on. So, of course, your exam is a take-home exam, and conventionally, the 3-hour exam, my final exam is a 3-hour exam, so I'm going to cut this exam down, and instead of offering you 9 questions, I'm going to offer you 6 questions, and you need to write an answer to 2 of them rather than 3. So it's a shorter exam. But I guess I'll send out an email on this as well to make sure that you sort of understand this. And I'll be sending the exam. I'm hoping to send it out before the conclusion of classes on the 19th. And you'll basically work on it as a take-home and upload it. Are there any questions about that? Okay. So let's do 2 more review questions before we get back into the narrative. And these 2 questions, this would be question 19 and 20, which deal with Cambodia. So question 19, in the 1950s and early 1960s, it was commonly said that Cambodia was a paradise. How truthful was this view? Well, journalists and so on from the West took this view, especially in the light of the bad things that were happening in neighboring Vietnam. And they noted that first of all, Cambodia was at peace. Sihanouk had adopted a policy of neutralism. So Cambodia was protecting itself against the spillover of the conflict from Vietnam. Secondly, the situation of the peasants appeared pretty good. In contrast to Vietnam, there were no landlords in Cambodia, and it seemed like a very productive economy, peasant economy, because there were ample supplies of fish and rice. I explained the flooding of the Mekong Valley and so on, and it was relatively easy to gain a living, it seemed. And furthermore, Sihanouk, it's true that Sihanouk was dictatorial. He was authoritarian, although very nice. But he had built up the health and education infrastructure in the country, And the general attitude of the overall population, especially the peasants, was Sihanouk is good for us. Sihanouk is an enlightened ruler. And he's maintaining peace in the country and uh, a our way of life, um, and this traditional way of life based on Buddhism and so on, reverence to the king, family, and so on. So all in all, we could say that things were seemed very good, but underneath, as I explained, uh, partly as a result of the beneficent policies, especially with regard to health, the birth rate increased dramatically, the death rate declined, and there was a rapid buildup of population. By 1970, there was clear land shortage. Many peasant families didn't have enough land to maintain their families. Many of them were becoming tenants or had to go to work on other people's farms. And there was an increasing polarization amongst the peasants between rich and poor peasants. So that was one thing. The other thing was, of course, in this situation, people needed money. They borrowed money from Chinese grain merchants or millers at very high interest rates, usurious rates of interest, and therefore there was this exploitation going on. And as a result of that, the indebtedness of the population as overall, the surpluses that were produced by the peasants basically went to the cities. And a growing split developed between and resentment in the rural areas vis-a-vis the urban elites, the merchants, the middle class, the bureaucrats, the army. There was this town-country split in the country that certainly played a part in what happened under the Khmer Rouge. Furthermore, we have to say that in order to maintain the so-called neutralism, Sihanouk, and this is where we're talking about the failure, had to concede to Hanoi and the National Liberation Front the sanctuaries, the building of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the opening of the port of Sihanouk to Russian merchant ships delivering supplies to the NLF. So it was a curious kind of neutralism. And of course, the United States noticed all this, and it began to put a lot of pressure on Sihanouk, and indeed even to engage in plots and conspiracies since the 1950s against Sihanouk. And indeed, in 1965, Sihanouk suspended diplomatic relations with the United States. And at the same time, he sort of nationalized foreign trade because of the problem of the balance of payments. So what I'm basically saying is that the economy was getting into trouble, and the neutralism, the political neutralism, was clearly beginning to come apart. So that's the answer. And of course, then you could say by 1968, the rural insurrection had started in Bantam Bang, and in the spring of 1969, Nixon began to heavily bomb eastern Cambodia. The idea of neutralism was basically collapsing. And of course, in the spring of 1970, Sihanouk was overthrown. The next question, explain why Prince Sihanouk attempted, why this is a sort of another variant of the previous question, attempted to pursue a neutralist policy with respect to the war in Vietnam. Why did he fail? Well, I've already explained. He was faced, on the one hand, with the demands of Hanoi and the NLF. On the other hand, the demands of the Americans against the sanctuaries and the Ho Chi Minh Trail and Sihanoukville. And the response was, as I've explained, the Americans were plotting against him. They broke off diplomatic relations with them. At the same time, the communists were basically openly operating in eastern Cambodia. They were trucking supplies from Sihanoukville. And so this neutralist policy was untenable. And by 1969, Sihanouk faced direct American bombardment, followed by the invasion of 1970. Are there any questions about these two answers? Okay, let's get into the narrative. Well, the invasion of 1970, it did help a little bit in the sense that the American-backed general, Lon Nol, was able to consolidate power. And the sanctuaries were disrupted for a few months as a result of the invasion of the Americans and the armed forces. But they didn't, the communist forces simply disappeared into the jungle. And after a few months, they began to sort of come back. So it didn't work very well. Well, therefore, Nixon, he turned his attention to Laos, where the situation was also deteriorating. And once again, Nixon conceived the idea that he could help Vietnamization by basically cutting the Ho Chi Minh Trail, by, instead of invading via Cambodia, he would basically conduct a operation in southern Laos. And I'm trying to bring that up. Just a second. You got the idea. Now this map is a map of basically the area of operations. And what you have here, this is close to the demilitarized zone. The demilitarized zone is up here. Laos is here. And as a matter of fact, the Khe Sanh, you remember Khe Sanh, which was close to the DMZ and close to Laos. It was this heavily fortified American base, which became the center of attention in 1968. It was part of the Tet Offensive. So it was still there. Khe Sanh was still there. And it had the advantage, of course, of surveying both communist operations along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which are here, but also communist operations north of the demilitarized zone. So the American idea was, we'll send the South Vietnamese army we'll send the South Vietnamese army into to block the Ho Chi Minh Trail here instead of in Cambodia. And this time, instead of the Americans accompanying the forces of the ARVN would be on its own. There would be this great test of the capacity of ARVN to basically fight without needing to support the direct ground support of the United States. The United States would confine its role to simply air power. And the ARVN would invade, and for 3 months, it would block completely the Ho Chi Minh Trail and impede the whole communist operation in South Vietnam, giving Thieu a chance to consolidate further, both militarily and politically in South Vietnam. So this operation was known as Operation Lam Song 719. Lam Song 719. And this is what we're leading up to here. Here's the here it is right on the on Word. Operation Lam Son 719. So first we have the invasion of Cambodia, 1970. Then we have Operation Lam Son 719, the big test of Vietnamization. So I want to lead up to this by delving further into the politics of Laos to explain what was going on in Laos. Now, I explained that Laos, as a country, it is basically, let's see if I can. Yeah, here it is. Here is Laos right here or here. And you can see it's conceived of as a kind of a tree lying, sort of leaning over to the left. And to the east is North Vietnam. To the south is Cambodia. To the west is Thailand. And in the very north here is the border, the frontier with China, the People's Republic. So it's a remote country. It's largely covered with forest. Its economy was scarcely developed. Most of the people, there were about 3.5 million people, were peasant farmers. The Mekong River ran right through Laos down into Cambodia, and this was the most fertile part, the valley of the Mekong up here. And so you see the development of a certain number of towns, small towns, along the banks of the Mekong River, including the capital, Vientiane, were located here. And it was in this region that the largest ethnic group, the Lao, therefore the name Laos, the Laos lived mainly 45% of the population of 3.5 million. They lived along the Mekong, small plots of land and so on. There were scarcely any landlords, as I say, and as I've already indicated, given the rudimentary nature of the economy, subsistence economy, there was only a small number of significant towns of any sort, and that's where the sort of merchants and craftsmen lived. Now, so 45% of the population is Lao in ethnic origin, and then as you move eastward towards North Vietnam, you see a different ethnic makeup. There were the Hmong and the Cao people. these two other people. Those are the main ethnic groups in the country. And most people live by basically rice and corn. They raise rice and corn as a livelihood, and in terms of the towns, the Laos did not live in or the ethnic groups did not live in the towns for the most part. They lived in the countryside, and there were Vietnamese merchants and craftsmen who were prominent in the towns. Now, like Cambodia and Vietnam, conquered by the French, colonized as part of the Federation of Indochina, we saw that in the early 30s, in response, Ho Chi Minh creates the Indo-Chinese Communist Party. And as in Cambodia, it's dominated in Laos by Vietnamese. The Laos are really not participating for the most part. So that's the situation in Laos. The war comes, World War II breaks out, and the French are conquered by the Japanese. The Japanese allow the French colonial administration to continue. They are the overlords right through the war. And I would say that one of the things happen is the war stimulates Laotian nationalism, especially because whereas the Japanese tended to favor Thailand, there were some border conflicts and so on. The Japanese tended to favor Thailand, which was an ally. The French, under the Japanese, discreetly promoted the idea of Laotian nationalism. For example, during the war period, the French took the initiative to set up Boy Scouts, a Boy Scout movement. The French established the Boy Scout movement as a way of indirectly fostering Laotian nationalism. So there was a certain tension between the French and the Japanese during the war. Well, the French come back, as you know, just as they did in Cambodia and in Vietnam. After the war, they tried to establish themselves. And by this time, this nationalism led to the establishment, with the help of the Viet Minh. War between the French and the Viet Minh broke out in 46. Well, the Viet Minh played an important role in organizing a nationalist movement, ultimately controlled by the communists, known as the Lao Nation, or as it was known in their own language, the Pathet Lao, the Lao Nation. And if you can believe it, the leader of this group, a communist, was Prince Suvarnabhong. Prince Suvarnabhong. Now, Prince Suvarnabhong had studied in Paris. He was a member of the royal house. He was not part of directly of the ruling dynasty, but he was part of the ruling circle. In France, he had become a communist, joined the PCF, the French Communist Party, became an engineer, and espoused a certain modernism. The Laos must come into the 20th century. He goes back to Laos. He's acted against Japanese, and after the war, he takes direction of the path of Lao. He becomes the leader right through the post-war period, is Prince Suvarnabhong. Now, he didn't espouse the proletariat. There was no proletariat. No, what he espoused was the development of nationalism, radical anti-colonialism, and of course, modernization of the country. that these were essentially the, and of course, policies that favored the peasants. And he became the most popular leader in the country, Prince Souvarnabhum. But it's important to mention, in terms of the politics, two other figures have to be mentioned. There was another well-connected person by the name of Souvarnapuma, and this man, as between the Pathet Lao and the right-wing forces, he became the leader of what we call the neutralists. The Pathet Lao were the communists. Souvarnapuma was a neutralist. He wanted a policy which favored neither the communists nor the conservatives, a neutralist policy, and had a certain following, particularly in the towns. Finally, there was the leader of the right wing, Phumi Nosavan, who, whatever, there were maybe 20 landlords in this country. They supported Phumi Nosavan. So did the Mandarins in the capital, the old Mandarin elite. There was a monarchy, a Mandarin elite. They supported Phumi Nosavan. The commercial interests, including Vietnamese merchants, merchants from Thailand, they supported Phumi Nosavan, as did the kind of army, which was small enough. The army, the officer corps, also supported Phumi Nosavan. Now, well, as a matter of fact, the conflict unfurled. The Vietnam War is going on. The war against the French breaks out in 46. It continues to 53, 54. Well, there's war in Laos as well. And by 1953, most of the country, with the exception of the Mekong River Valley, which is the most heavily populated area, as I've explained, that country, the rural areas, the whole of the South, and the whole of the eastern part of the country is under the control of the Pathet Lao by 1953. And they are being assisted by the Viet Minh. You'll recall the battles of the Red River Valley, and then the Viet Minh lured the French into Dien Bien Phu, and so on. There's conflict going on in Laos, and the Viet Minh want this to happen because it forces the French to sort of spread their forces out so that they can be more easily attacked. Well, it all comes to a head with the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. The French are defeated in the spring of 54, and as a result of that, confirmed by the Geneva Conference, Laos becomes independent and neutral. That's written into the Geneva Accord. Although the Pathet Lao were not represented at Geneva, they were represented by the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. The United States wouldn't allow the Cambodian communists and the Laotian communists to attend the Geneva Conference, but it was all done through the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. Now, of course, the monarchy was so it was a independent. It's supposed to be an independent state under this royal monarchy. There were even elections organized and so on, and it was supposed to be a neutral state. And under these circumstances, a first coalition government combining all three of these elements, political elements, the right, the left, and the neutral party were all represented in this first coalition government of 1953 to 1957. But what happened was that in 1957, there was a second round of elections. The Pathet Lao were quite active, and essentially they won the election. They won 2/3 of the seat in the parliament. 2/3 of the seats went to the Pathet Lao. Well, Phumi Nosavan would not accept the outcome. He staged a coup d'etat, and as a result, a second round of fighting broke out between 1958 and 1962. And once again, the Pathet Lao were successful. They occupied most of the territory, although not the Mekong River Valley, where most of the population lived. But most of the rest of Laos, not all, but most of it was under the control of the Pathet Lao. Now, in saying that, there was one area which was a subject of contention, which plays an important role, and we have to mention that. In this area here, which abuts North Vietnam, this is where the Hmong people were to be found, the Hmong. Now, the Hmong, their numbers were something like 250,000 people. This was an upland region, which is hilly and mountainous. They lived up in these mountains. As a matter of fact, we should note that the Hmong were not confined to Laos. This, what we can call these people montagnards, as the French call them, people who lived in the mountains. This 250,000 people. Well, there was a lot of them who actually lived in China. South China has some 5 or 6 million Hmong people. So one shouldn't confuse, one has to note that it's a little bit more complicated. I guess this shows the area where they're concentrated, this area here. Well, they were divided. Some of them sympathized with the Pathet Lao. There were these tribal divisions amongst them. And others, they favored Phumi Nosavan and the right wing in Laotian politics. There was this element. And these people were good soldiers. They were very good soldiers. And they affiliated themselves with the royal government. They were against the Pathet Lao. And part of the reasons for this, all these people basically lived by raising subsistence crops. They lived, you couldn't raise rice. It was mainly corn, but they had a second crop, which was quite important. This was opium. This was the center of opium production in Laos. And the Hmong, they produced most of this opium that was produced in Laos. And in terms of the growing relationship with the United States, we're now in the early 60s, the Americans were significantly reinforcing the right wing in Laotian politics. One of the things that the Americans did was to build a relationship with the Hmong against the communists. And so one of the things the Americans started to do was basically to help the Hmong market the opium. And the CIA actually created a special company called Air America, which flew the opium out of the country. And notably, one of the places where the stuff was marketed especially was in South Vietnam. And as I explained, um, the um, the officers of the South Vietnamese army and the leading bureaucrats, they had a stake in this opium trade, as did the Americans. And so you get this kind of odd relationship with these Hmong. And furthermore, as the 60s continued, the Americans began to build on some of the high mountains in this region, radio signal stations, very inaccessible, which could monitor radio signals in North Vietnam and also could direct the bombing of North Vietnam when it began in 1965. It was from these radio stations. And so, and this was all protected by these Hmong people. Incidentally, where these people ultimately were decimated and forced to flee Laos. Does anybody know where these people ended up? Tens of thousands of Hmong, I think the total is about 150,000, were forced into exile. Where did they go? Anybody know? They went to Canada and they went to the United States. That's where they're living, especially Minnesota and Southern Ontario, a few in Winnipeg. In any case, this is one element of support. I'm saying the Pathet Lao had the greater support, but the Hmong supported them, and also the Americans also helped to bring mercenaries from Thailand, who bolstered the weak Royal Laotian Army. So I would say the party, the Phumi Nosavan party, the right-wing party, is a sort of a mix of all these sort of elements. There are Thai mercenaries, there are Hmong, there is the army proper, there are the generals, there are the merchants. The Americans are facilitating things by flooding the country with money, and also Protestant missionaries are very active. I would say that many of the Hmong were ultimately converted to Protestantism and so on. So this is a strange conglomeration. Now, on what basis did the Americans intervene? Well, it was basically the same deal as in Vietnam and in Cambodia. The terms of the first of all, the Americans said, well, we never signed the Geneva Accords. We just gave our verbal assent. And secondly, the Geneva Accords say that Laos and Cambodia might be threatened by foreign elements. And since North Vietnam has built the Ho Chi Minh Trail right down the eastern border of Laos, this is what was the reality. You can see this. I guess this is a tracing of the Ho Chi Minh Trail down through Laos into Cambodia and Vietnam. It's all in the territory, the easternmost territory of Laos. Basically, the North Vietnamese have occupied the eastern part of Laos. So the Americans say, well, if that's the case, we're intervening to help the anti-communist forces. Well, by 1962, I'd say the war rages from 1958 until 1962. Once again, the Pathet Lao are on the edge of victory. As a matter of fact, there's a big battle in the very north of Laos, near the Chinese frontier, between the Royal Army and the Pathet Lao. And the Royal Army is completely demolished by the Pathet Lao. They flee for their lives. And indeed, it's so bad that many of the elites in the Mekong Valley, in the capital, Vientiane, and other towns, they cross into Thailand. They're afraid that the communists will completely take over in 62. It's at this point that Kennedy, who's building up South Vietnam at this point, Diem is in power and so on, he declares in the face of this emergency, this imminent takeover of Laos, that the Americans are considering basically intervening not only in South Vietnam, but in Laos. Well, Kennedy thinks better of that. And he and his advisors basically say, no, the fight is in South Vietnam. Laos is too remote. It's too close to China. We don't need this. And so Kennedy arranges to negotiate with the Russians a renewal of the neutralism of Laos. And Suvarnabhumi Phang, the neutralist, is reinstalled at the head of another coalition in 1962. So there was the first coalition, 53 to 57, and now in 62, it's reconstituted. However, that being said, yes, Suvarnabhumi remains, Puma remains in as premier, but the American presence has become with they're building these radar stations, with their alliance with the Hmong, with the connections with the mercenaries from Thailand, and with the flooding of money into the country by the Americans. They dominate the politics of the country. The Americans, the Pathet Lao are there in the countryside, but the American presence in the towns, if you like, and there's a lot of corruption around the distribution of American money. And despite the American attempts to bolster the right wing and the Royal Laotian Army, it simply cannot stand up to the Pathet Lao. And so what the Americans do, starting in 1965, this is 4 years before they begin the systematic bombing of Cambodia. In 1965, the coalition is breaking down, and in order to keep the Pathet Lao out of power, the Americans launch massive bombing attacks from 65 onward. So not only are they bombing North Vietnam and South Vietnam, they are now bombing Laos as well. This is 4 years before they begin to bomb Cambodia. And the bombing is really simply terrible. Between 65 and the end of the war, say 74, 10-year period, the Americans dropped more bombs on Laos because the army there's no army to fight the Pathet Lao. So the only way the Americans can maintain whatever influence is by bombing. And so they drop more bombs than the Americans dropped during the whole of World War II on Germany and Japan. It's a massive bombing, incredible destruction of life and whatever property there is in the country. It's all done from afar. This idea of conducting a war at a distance becomes confirmed. You have the drone warfare of today. Well, it stems back to this period. And Laos, even now, suffers from the fact that the place was completely carpet bombed again and again and again. And it's had difficulty overcoming this, although a certain amount of progress has occurred in Laos since then. The thing is, much of the population actually had to leave the countryside, and they had to flee to the capital. By the end of the war, Vientiane, by the end of the war, almost 1 million Laotian refugees were living in the capital because they had to flee the countryside under the weight of the American bombing. But the Pathet Lao, they constructed caves and dugouts. They lived in the jungle, and they operated, and they basically were an occupation of most of the land by the end of the war. Meanwhile, as I explained, the Ho Chi Minh Trail was becoming a road, a highway, and basically the whole of eastern Laos was under the control of the PAVN, the North Vietnamese Army, basically controlled the whole route from Hanoi down to Cambodia was under the control of the PAVN. So this is the situation in Laos. Well, we saw in 1970, the Americans tried to interdict the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Cambodia. Now in 1971, they try the same thing in southern Laos, near the DMZ. Let me find this other map. Oh, no, that's not going to work. This is a map of which shows the sort of the PAVN, the Ho Chi Minh Trail down into Cambodia and so on. While I'm looking for this. Yeah, it's here you see the place of operation of this this operation, this invasion of Cambodia. To the east is Khe Sanh, near the DMZ, right? Well, this is there is a town which is a few miles into Laos from, it's directly west of Khe Sanh along a highway known as Highway number 9. This highway number 9 leads to the border with Laos from Khe Sanh and then on to this town located about 30 miles within Laos. And this became the target of this operation. And this operation, as explained, was an operation something like 25,000 ARVN troops were sent westward from Khe Sanh down Highway number 9, and they entered Laos in the spring of it was in February of 1971. And their mission was basically to block the Ho Chi Minh Trail for 3 months to therefore give more time for Vietnamization to work and to help, of course, General Tu and so on. But by this point, the drawdown of American troops was very advanced. There was something like 150,000 American troops left, but only 20,000 of these troops were available for combat. And so this plan was drawn up as the major test of Vietnamization, because it would be ARVN and ARVN alone, which hadn't fought alone since 1965, the big American invasion, who would invade, conduct the operations, while the Americans would be in support using air power and helicopters. This would be the nature of this operation, a major test of Vietnamization. Well, General Giap had wind of this operation. That the Americans were going to, with General Tu, were going to try this to block the Ho Chi Minh Trail. He was aware of it. How was he aware of it? Because he had spies all through the ARVN who monitored these preparations and delivered all of the plans to General Giap. He knew beforehand. And so what Giap does is he prepares for this South Vietnamese invasion. He brings in 40,000 fresh PAVN troops, heavily armed with tanks and artillery, into the area around Chepone. He brings in preparation for the arrival of these ARVN forces. And the ARVN basically crosses the border on February 8th, 1971. As I say, all told, something like 25,000 ARVN troops are conducting this operation. Lo and behold, it's the rainy season, and air operations, they're intermittent. There is some support from the Americans, but the weather's not that good. And so the ARVN forces are marching and steadily advancing down the road towards this Chepone, which is supposedly the headquarters of the communist operation. And as they march, they begin to come under heavy fire. In the hills surrounding Highway number 9, the communists have implanted heavy artillery and mortars, and they begin to rain bombs down on these ARVN forces. And the ARVN becomes bogged down along the road. Some of them are able partially to move into Chepone, but most of them never even reach their objective. They're just strung out along this road. And in the course of late February, early March 1971, the PAVN begin to the counteroffensive of the PAVN begins to become more and more serious. And as a result, at a certain point, the ARVN generals order a retreat, and 8,000 of these ARVN troops panic and begin to flee back down Highway number 9, and they are basically virtually annihilated by the PAVN. They're decimated, and not only are they decimated, but so there are only about half the troops make it back into South Vietnam. Most of them, half of them are killed. And secondly, the American Air Force, particularly the helicopters, it's a catastrophe for the American, the Americans are conducting this war using helicopters in the hundreds, if not the thousands. Well, in order to sort of keep the operation going, the Americans were supporting all of this with their helicopters. And the result was over 700 American helicopters were either shot down or put out of operation by the communists. The Americans suffered, 90 American pilots were killed, and about 180 were wounded in this debacle. The pictures coming back, the media, they showed pictures of the retreat of the ARVN. And you could see this total panic to the point where some of the ARVN troops were holding on to the skids of the helicopters. That is to say, the helicopters would take off filled with fleeing soldiers. Some of them were holding on and basically dropped from the sky because they couldn't hold on as the helicopters fled. So this was a catastrophe. Now, remember, this was a positional confrontation. It was a test of Vietnamization. And it was a debacle, utter failure of the ARVID, which I've repeated this, they simply were not able to, for the most part, to carry on operations. Well, I'll finish this in the next class.